Good morning. How's everybody doing today? It's good to be back up here with you. Had a guy in the first service stop me in the hallway when he found out that I was sharing. He's like, "Are you going to be seated again?" I don't know what he meant by that, but I sit because you guys are seated. Like, why do I got to stand for 30 minutes? So, anyways, it's my style. What do you got to do? And what is that? Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. I will. And hello to the online crew. You are just as much here as we are, and we love you. Glad that you're participating. So have you ever noticed that there's always more people in our world claiming to be wise than are actually wise? Like there's kind of a gap between that, right? Like think about the people who claim to be wise. Politicians, of course, they're always telling us they know things, right? Religious leaders, let's get this one out of the way. Sometimes we up front come across wise and we're not actually wise. Bosses, maybe you have a boss that claims to be a wise person, but you're like, they're not wise. How about car salesmen? They always get a bad rap. Sorry if you're a car salesman in here. We got coaches, teachers, right? Parents sometimes, friends always perceive themselves as wise, but maybe aren't wise. Well, our world is in desperate need of more wise men and women. I don't know if you can tell this, but we need a fresh dose of wise men and women. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is how to become wise people. Just kind of getting into how we can become more wise. Recently, I visited the Redwood Forest in Northern California. Has anybody been to the Redwood Forest? A lot of you. Awesome. So I'd grown up in Michigan, right? And I'd seen all the trees and heard about it in school. And even some of my family, like in the 70s, there's like photo books of them visiting these massive trees in California. So it was super awesome 2 weekends ago to get some time and drive down there, just hiking through the redwoods, driving through some of the scenic drives. I mean, even if you're not a tree fan, like those trees will make anybody a fan, like these massive, huge trees. And I'm kind of a nerd. Whenever I go on a trip now, I kind of come home and I just want to research, like learn about it. So I go on YouTube and Google, and I'm starting to like, what are the redwoods known for, that sort of thing. And so I wondered if you'd humor me this morning. I want to share some facts that I learned about redwood trees, okay, since I came back from this trip. The first fact is that redwoods intertwine their roots with each other to stabilize one another and share nutrients. So I would think that a tree hundreds of feet tall would have massively deep roots, right? Like a skyscraper kind of thing. But I was surprised to learn they're only like 6 to 12 feet deep, and that's rare and different. It's unique to the redwood trees. The way that they stabilize, the way that they stand so tall and not fall over is that intertwined root system. I found that to kind of be interesting. Another fact, the bark can be up to a foot thick, and it's full of an organic substance that protects it from bugs, rot, and fire so that it can live thousands of years. So it's basically got a security system built in through this organic substance in that massive, thick bark. Redwoods can be so big and old that other trees and plants live on their branches and trunks. Like other trees are living on top of the redwoods. And finally, there are species of birds and salamanders that live their entire lives up in the redwood canopy, meaning they live their whole life. They never come down to the floor, onto the earth's surface. That's crazy to me, to think that there are animals that just live up there. And why we're talking about trees, you're like, I'm at church, right? Like this isn't science class. I think that redwood trees are actually a perfect picture of what we're going to be talking about today, which is a metaphor for me of people who are actually wise rather than claiming to be wise. I mean, think about these trees are so unique in that they have endured so many things that could have threatened their life. This last tree here, which again, Californians, they're great at naming trees. They call this one Big Tree. So yeah, no shame on the Californians. I know some of you are from there, but that is funny to me that they're just like, let's call that one Big Tree. So that tree right there was the biggest one I saw when I was on my trip, and it's estimated to be 1,500 years old. Like, slow down enough to think about what that one single tree had to endure to continue living 1,500 years. Like, that's insane to me. I mean, think about it. Wildfires, lightning strikes, drought, season of drought, and deforestation. They think that all but 5% of old growths were cut down for lumber, just 5% remaining of that old growth. There was a lot more redwood trees. And think about, again, this one tree wouldn't have to face that like one time or two times, but all these things hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times over 1,500 years. That's wild. And so that for me is a picture of the kind of believers that I think God desires. He's looking for people to be like these redwood trees, Christ followers with a deep and rich faith, born out of repeated experiences trusting God, which grew them over time into tall, respectable leaders in the church that others look up to for wisdom. It makes me think of Psalm chapter 1, verse 3, again, talking about a tree. It says, that person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. Now, I've been blessed over the course of my life to have a few redwood mentors, what I'll call redwood mentors in my life. Two come to mind, Nellie and Jim. Nellie is the woman who invited me when I was just a 17-year-old punk to check out the middle school ministry, to volunteer. And I had never worked with young kids, didn't have any younger siblings, never, just was like, why would I ever work with young kids? And yet this smiling lady was like, hey, come check out the middle school ministry. And I was like, okay. So the rest is kind of history. Like, it's crazy that woman's, asking me that invitation started my journey with Christ as well as my career. It's really neat. And she has remained one of my spiritual heroes throughout my journey. She still encourages me regularly. Jim's one of my mentors who I meet with monthly to this day. I'm continuing to meet with him, and he walked me through a couple career transitions as well as dark periods in my faith. And while they haven't met each other, Jim and Nellie share a similar approach. They're always pointing me back, nudging me back to Jesus. They're both quick to say, have you prayed about it, right? They always are nudging me in that direction. And at times, Jim has stopped me right in the middle of some rant. I mean, I'm just going off and just sharing my heart, and he's just like, hey, how's your heart? Have you prayed about this? Have you given that to the Lord? And so I wonder this morning, enough about me, do you have those kind of people in your life? Do you have redwood mentors? Do you have people that you look up to, people that you respect their faith and that you're striving to get wisdom from? If not, I want to help you find some this morning. I want to make this practical and think of ways that maybe you can connect with someone like that. I mean, after all, none of us want to end up a lyric in a Taylor Swift song, do we? I mean, I'm sorry, Taylor Swift's awesome, but you don't want to end up in any of her songs because she's breaking up with you or, just ending your life kind of thing. And so the opening line in Taylor's most recent hit says this. It says, I have this thing where I get older, but just never wiser. I have this thing where I get older, but just never wiser. And that's most of us, isn't it? Can we just be honest here in church? I'll go first, okay? When I look back at my journals from my 20s, I'm ashamed to admit to you at times how little things have changed, right? I continue to make similar mistakes. I continue to have things in my life that I'm just like, why is that still there? And I've gotten physically older, but not always wiser, right? And so can you relate? I imagine that some of you can this morning. Maybe we didn't value wisdom as much as other things. Maybe we've been looking for wisdom from the wrong sources. Maybe we didn't spend much time around wise people. Well, thankfully, there's hope for us this morning. God, through the book of James, offers us a solution if we find ourselves needing more wisdom or finding ourselves the same person we were when we were younger. And so we've been in this series, kind of a unique series for us at Foothills here. I don't know if we've ever done it in the history of the church, certainly not since I've been here, where we're going verse by verse through the book of James. So if you're new here today, go back and check the earlier passages. And so just as a reminder, James is a book about putting our money where our mouth is, right? If you understand that figure of speech. James is not cool with us just saying we believe in Jesus, but we don't do anything with it, right? Because Christians, we can talk a good game. Most of us have opinions about nearly everything, and then we share it on Facebook, right? We have lots of opinions on things. But I noticed something about myself and others in my life who claim to be Christians. We often bail when it costs us something, right? Like, we got to put our money where our mouth is. Like, it's one thing to have opinions and say we believe all these things until it costs us something, until we have to do something, until we have to sacrifice. Then we're like, I'm out, right? And James is a book. He calls us out. He calls Christians out of a passive faith in Jesus. It's not about passivity to James. And so let's look at our passage today. We're going to read from James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. And just as a side note, Pastor Dale often teaches from the New Living Translation. I'm going to teach from the NIV, the New International Version. Sam will teach next week. Sometimes he uses the English Standard. So you're getting a wide range of biblical knowledge here, okay? Free of charge. So let's check out James chapter 3, verse 13. It says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness." So I've been marinating on this passage. I literally printed it out and just put it on the wall, and I've just been reading it over and over again, trying to understand what is James saying, what would be beneficial for us today to learn. And where I landed is he's contrasting two ultimate sources of wisdom. Like, when you sum it all up, we get wisdom from a lot of different places, but when you really kind of package them together, we either get it from heaven above or earth below. Like, he's contrasting, like, you want to get wisdom from here, you want to get wisdom from here, like that's, and it really is a choice. I think this is important to note at the start here, that wisdom is really a choice we each get to make, created in the image of God with free will. We believe in this church that all humans are created in the image of God, but we also have free will, free choice. We're able to choose or not. So God will not force us to make wise choices, right? And you can look around, not necessarily suggesting this morning, but you just look around in our world, there's a lot of people making unwise choices, right? None here today. We're all wise. We don't make unwise choices. But God will never force us to be wise. He will allow us. He will let us be unwise if we choose to be. And so I'm going to assume this morning that most of you would like to at least grow a little bit in your wisdom, want to grow wiser. And so for the rest of our time, I want to go back through our text this morning, making some observations from James on what wisdom from above looks like. Well, at the same time, these observations, I think, are really good things to consider when you search for your own Redwood mentors, okay? So when you're thinking about people that you would want to spend time with and get wisdom, because if you don't hear anything I say this morning, please don't miss this, that you can get knowledge in isolation, but rarely wisdom. Okay? You can sit alone in your bedroom at a computer screen and you can get a lot of knowledge, like I did with the Redwoods, right? We can point and click and learn from YouTube and Google, and we can get all this knowledge on some topic. But you're rarely going to get wisdom in isolation. Nothing has made me wiser over the course of my life than time spent with wise people, right? And Proverbs says this, King Solomon, one of the wisest men to ever, if not the wisest man, said, "Walk with the wise and become wise." So please hear that this morning, that these are all points and things, but the real impact happens when we walk with wise people. So observation number one from our passage, wisdom from above is evidenced by deeds, not degrees. Wisdom from above is evidenced by deeds, not degrees. Verse 13 again, it says, "Who is wise and understanding among you?" And I want you to see it as wise among us. Yes, students, the game last few years, Among Us, right? So James is speaking to a church. He's not speaking to a nation. He's not speaking to every human being. He's saying, who is wise and understanding among you, among us, Foothills? So I want us to think in this faith community. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good deeds, or by their good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Just admit it. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. Back in 2019, literally months before the world would go into all the chaos of 2020, I spent a week at a place called Onsite in the hills of Tennessee. I joined with 30 strangers for what would be a mix of therapy and spiritual retreat. And on day one, they took our cell phones, so 7 days completely disconnected from the outside world. And they gave us all one rule that we had to follow the entire week, and that was you could not share with anybody there what you did for a living. And I absolutely loved it, okay? Because at first, it just took away that little thing we do in culture of kind of sizing people up and making many judgments, right, based upon how much money they make or what they do for a living. And as a pastor, I especially liked it because it's one of those jobs that every time I introduce myself, what do you do for a living? I'm a pastor. And they're like, immediately, like I can't tell you, like you can see it in their face, the relationship changes. When you say you're a pastor and you meet someone, it just brings so much baggage in. And I hate how people act differently around you because you're a pastor. I tell the students I work with all the time, just be you. Like, don't edit. Don't try to change and put this mask on. Like, how does the Kurt want me to act around him? Just be whoever you are. Talk the way you talk at school. Act the way that you act around everyone. And while I certainly am proud of earning a master's degree and with all the knowledge I gained from the Bible and writing tons of papers there, the wisdom came not from earning a degree, but rather in the trenches as I started doing youth ministry year after year, interacting with situations and people. I mean, what do you do when in your first month at a job as a youth pastor, a girl in your youth group takes her own life? What does seminary have to teach you on that? How do you handle the angry parent whose kid was injured at an event that you planned? Like, you're the one who put that thing together, you designed it, and a kid gets injured. What do you say when one of your volunteers tells you that God told her to leave her husband and family of 10 years for another man? Like, seminary is great, has great value. I'm not underselling, I really value seminary, but only wisdom helped me navigate those situations. It makes me think of a verse, this idea of deeds, not degrees, out of 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1. It says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Man, that's a beautiful verse, right? Because my mind immediately goes to like a tire inflating. It puffs up. It's like someone with a big head, right? They sat at their computer and they got a bunch of information, and so they're like, I'm super smart, right? It puffs you up. It makes you think often you're better than others. But it's love that builds up. Both builds you up, but it builds others up. And I know some of us have verses tattooed, on our body. Like, if you're looking for a verse to tattoo, that is a good one, okay? 1 Corinthians 8:1, it'll remind you. You can go see Stephanie over at Back 40 Tattoo, okay? Just literally right down the street. I know some of you have. She's got anyways. If you don't agree with me on this concept, let's go to Jesus, okay? Because ultimately, he's the guy that we're following after here. And so think about Jesus' approach when it comes to gaining wisdom. We don't see Jesus taking his 12 disciples and setting up a temple or like a school of ministry. And like for 3 years, everybody sit down and hear what I have to say and get your degree, get your little certificate, right? Instead, we see him taking them from town to town, the disciples from town to town, giving them wisdom as they did stuff, as they loved people by doing stuff, healing people, feeding people, debating with the religious leaders. I mean, these guys are unskilled people, most of them fishermen. They didn't know people in the ways that, we might think they do. We look up to these guys, but they were just normal, ordinary men, and that Jesus just took and taught them wisdom over time by doing things. And it's no different for us today. We should never forget that as a church, the goal of this thing isn't for us to just sit around here every Sunday and like gain knowledge, biblical knowledge. We just get fat in our biblical knowledge, right? Like, God's desire is still that you and I would bring our lost coworkers, neighbors, and family back to God. That is still the mission. The mission then is the mission now, which is to seek and save lost people. And so I know some of you are sitting there, you're saying, but Kurt, I can't get them to come to church. I can't get my parents to come to church. I can't get my friend to come to church, my coworker. Exactly. They're maybe never going to come, okay? Every time they interact with you, they interact with the church. Every time you're in a relationship with someone, you represent Jesus Christ. That's that whole ambassador of Christ thing. You are the church. And so bring Jesus to where those people are at. What are you expecting them to get at church? What are you expecting them to hear from the pastors? Say it to them. You have a voice. You have the ability, right? So bring Jesus to where they're at. So who is wise among us, Foothills? Those who are shown to be wise by their deeds, not their degrees. Look for mentors again who show they are wise by their consistent good deeds done in humility. That's a great mentor to find. Number 2, again, just taking observations from our passage in James. Wisdom from above puts others before ourselves. Wisdom from above, it puts others before ourselves. This is another one of the ways that having knowledge is different than being wise. It's always relational to its core. If you've lived longer than a day, we've all met that person who's really smart, but is kind of a jerk, is kind of mean. Like, we would never call that man or woman wise, would we? Like somebody who's just always telling you they know things. I like how the infamous and outspoken boxer Muhammad Ali once said, he said, "I don't trust anyone who's nice to me, but rude to the waiter. They would treat me the same way if I were in that position." As we grow wiser, we'll naturally begin putting others before ourselves, thinking about how our decisions, the choices we make, will impact them, not just us. Early on, I remember in my faith journey, I heard a speaker say that as Christians, we should always view ourselves as third. And I just, what, third? He said, you should always have God first, consider others second, and then yourself third. You're always third. And I don't like that. Do you? Like, I want to be first. It's part of like our human nature. Like, I want to be number one. Like, if you don't think so, like, when was the last time you ordered a pizza that you were going to share with somebody, right? Like, you have to decide, what are we going to put on that pizza? Like, who gets to decide what goes on the pizza, right? Because I'm pretty picky. I know y'all are not picky, but I'm like, it's got to be how I want that pizza if I'm going to put it in my mouth. I don't want no black olives on there and some of that disgusting stuff. Like, you all are weird who would put black olives on your pizza. Anyways, it's our nature to be selfish. Our sinful, fleshly kind of nature is to think about ourselves first, to put ourselves first. And while living in this country, living in America has advantages to our Christian faith, guys, this is not one of them, because our country puts what? Individual freedoms and individual rights. Again, great things. But when it comes to thinking of others before yourselves, there's often a conflict there. There's often an inner conflict that breaking out of that mindset will take God transforming us, helping us to think beyond number one, beyond my own interests. Look at verse 14 and see how this passage in James, see how these words are relational in their context. It says, "But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice." Now, I think this is one of the reasons why our political system is so broken today. Like, just park here for a minute, it probably won't offend anyone. So many of our leaders claim to put us first, and yet we find out later that they acted out of selfish ambition, right? Like, I mean, if a politician benefits financially, let's say, for a decision that they make, isn't it hard for us to think that they actually put us first, that they're thinking of our needs, our town, our part of the country? James says the result of selfish ambition is disorder and every evil practice. Doesn't that define our politics today? Disorder, evil practice. You hear these things going on in our country's politics. Years ago, I was part of a men's small group over in Beaverton area, kind of on the west side. Was at my first youth pastoring gig out there, and kind of was coming to the end of it, was starting to look for a new job in other states, and where God wanted to send me next kind of thing. And I'm in this men's small group, and I was in the process of interviewing at a church, and they told me, like, hey, you're awesome, but we just can't fly you out. We only have so many budget dollars, and so they were going to fly out the first pick, but not the second and third. I think it was second or third in that particular interview. And so I remember asking this small group of men who I just met about a month ago, I said, hey, could you guys pray about this? I really think it's a cool thing, but I don't know if God's leading me. I need wisdom on this situation. So I'm asking these guys to pray. And so I came, I think it was literally the next week, and I showed up, and one of the guys in the small group slid across the table a blank check and was like, I feel like God's telling me, like, you need to be at that interview. I'm going to pay for your airline ticket. I was like, what? Like just 3 weeks ago, I didn't even know this guy, and he's paying for me to fly to this interview. Like, talk about putting somebody else before, putting others first. Like, that is crazy to me. I can't think of a more wise person than someone like that. So who is wise among us? Those who put others first. Do you know anyone in your life who regularly does this, who puts others, they're constantly looking for ways to be unselfish? They would make a great candidate to mentor you. Finally, last observation this morning, wisdom from above looks a lot like the fruit of the Spirit. Wisdom from above, it looks a lot like the fruit of the Spirit. The more I read through our passage from James, the more verses 17 and 18 sounded familiar. It was just like, this sounds different, like another part of the Bible. It sounded a lot like a list of traits Paul wrote to the church in Galatia. Galatians 5:22 through 23, it says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law." Now check out our passage in James, verse 17. "But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness." Now, I wonder, some of you might be like me, when you see lists like this, you immediately feel guilty, right? Like, that was kind of how I was trained growing up, old school Baptist kid. Like, you see a list like this, and I immediately go to the ones that I'm not doing so well in. Like, I'm not very peaceful this week. I don't have tons of mercy, that self-control thing, right? And so I just feel bad after reading lists like that, because I'm like, I don't measure up. I'm not a good Christian. I'm not a great Christian. And so it's helpful to remember a couple things. First off, Paul says fruit of the Spirit, not fruits. Okay, you've probably wrongly heard this quoted before or thought of it in that way. And I think it's important because it's a package deal. He's saying the fruit of the Spirit is this list altogether. Not like it's you got to have that, you got to have that. Like, it's not like a grocery list of like, oh, I got to have all these things to have the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is all of this. It's a package deal. It's singular. Secondly, when we fully consider the metaphor that Paul's painting, we've got to go back to trees. Okay, I'm sorry for you tree haters here, but we're kind of got a sub-theme going of trees, so we're going to continue. And let's think of an apple tree. Everybody can picture an apple tree. It's pretty easy to picture, right? Take an apple tree. It doesn't have to try and grow apples, right? Like, an apple tree didn't wake up today and was like, oh, I hope I can grow. I'm trying to grow. Like, it grows apples because it's an apple tree, right? The fruit of the apple tree is apples, right? It doesn't need to go to a class or a seminary to learn how to produce apples. It produces apples because it's an apple tree. It's what apple trees do. And I think that's where Paul's getting at when he says the fruit of the Spirit is this. When you are filled with the Spirit of God, it looks like this. It's not something we are measuring ourselves, sizing ourselves up. And this bumps up to a theme that you've heard Pastor Dale say a bunch if you've been walking through this series on James, that I hope you're not missing, because it's one of the themes of the book, one of the thesis of his book, is that our works or good deeds are evidence of our faith in Jesus, not a way to earn it. So many years in my faith, guys, I was trying to earn God's love, right? Like, I got in by grace, but then I kept trying to earn it. I got to look and sound more like a Christian. And we shouldn't see James as a book of to-dos on how we can become great Christians, but instead it should be a measuring stick on how closely we're walking with Jesus, how tight our relationship with Jesus is, allowing him to transform us on the inside, then doing the sort of things that James is talking about. And for those that maybe you're still struggling, you're kind of on this internal journey like I was for many years, let me put a finer point on it right from Philippians 2, which Paul just drives this straight home explicitly. He says, "Therefore, my dear friends, as you've always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling." Watch this. "For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose." Do you see that? God's doing the heavy lifting. God's the one who does the work inside of us. It's not us trying to force it or make it happen. So, you want wisdom from above. I'm going to assume some of you again this morning, you're like, cool, Kurt, get practical. How do I get this wisdom that we've been talking about? How do I become a tall tree, a tall redwood tree? First, truly give your life to Jesus and keep him first in your life. So right out of what we just talked about, if we get close to Jesus, guess what we get in that relationship? Wisdom. Part of being connected to Jesus, we become wise men and women. And if you want to do a deeper study of this, check out John 15. John chapter 15, Jesus speaking. He's talking about staying connected to the vine, right? And again, that conversation there, he's saying again, I'm the one who brings spiritual vitality. I'm the one who brings transformation. It's your job, Christian, to stay connected to me, right? So check that out if you want to dive deeper into that. But truly give your life to Christ. Keep him first in your life. Secondly, just suggestion on getting wisdom, spend time with others who do the same. Right? Spend time with other people who are seeking God's wisdom, who are men and women who are committed to Christ. That's going to have that kind of effect. Again, this is a great list to start with. Go through the fruit of the Spirit. Look at these observations I've made and think about men and women in your life. Are they doing these things? Do they look like this? That would be a great mentor to help lead you. Fourth suggestion is to stay humble and teachable. Whatever age and stage you're at, guys, we should always stay humble, always stay teachable. There's always more to learn. There's always new people to interact with, new perspectives, right? That's how we're going to grow in our wisdom, is by giving us new opportunities to be teachable. And lastly, ask for it. Just ask for it, right? It seems fitting. We're talking about wisdom from above. That's ultimately from God. Let's ask God for wisdom. James 1 verse 5, again, one of the first conversations in this series. It says, now if any of you lacks wisdom, a lot of us here, most of us, he should ask God, who what? Gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. And I love that James included that line about not finding fault. Because I imagine, like me, I look in the mirror every day and I find a lot of fault. I find a lot of reasons not to give this guy wisdom. I'm sure some of you feel the same way. But guess what? God just says, ask me for it, I will give you wisdom. It's not about you being perfect, you measuring up, you having all the fruits of the Spirit, this list of things. It's not that. It's about him being our Father and us asking for it. And so I imagine in a group this size, as we wrap up, that there are some of you this morning that need wisdom like yesterday. Like you're in a situation in your life right now where you just could benefit from getting an answer from God. You need to know something. Maybe you're a senior in high school or you're going off to college and you're trying to figure out what you want to do career-wise. That's a huge pressure, right? That's a huge area where you could use some wisdom. I imagine some of you this morning, you're thinking about maybe ending or starting a relationship. Maybe you find yourself in a relationship and you're just like, oh, this person isn't good for me anymore. I'm just thinking about ending it. That's hard when your heart's connected. That's hard when you have shared memories. Maybe you need some wisdom from God on that. Or maybe finally there's somebody in here, you're dealing with some health issues. Your doctor's been recommending a new medication and you're just like, oh, that's scary with the side effects. I don't know if I should do that. I don't know if I should commit to that. Whatever area you need wisdom, financially, health-wise, relationally, we can ask God. We can do this morning exactly what James is saying and ask God for wisdom. And so I wondered this morning if we could do something maybe again a little different, kind of like this series. And I'm going to ask some of you this morning to stand up who needs wisdom. So you've identified there's an area this morning where you're like, Kurt, I need some wisdom. I need a decision, some help with the decision. I'm just going to invite you to stand up. And I'm going to say at the front end that this isn't like making your prayer like more favorable to get an answer from God. It's not like, oh, if I stand up, I'm going to get I'm closer to heaven, so maybe he'll hear me like God's deaf or something, right? But for me, it's less about God. It's more about me. When you change your posture, when you get up, it's like if I'm just seated, it's like I don't really mean it. But if you just stand up and you allow other people to see you standing, I find my posture, my prayer is a little bit more serious. And so stand up if you need wisdom. I'm going to pray for you. And I think that's just, again, a visual thing for you and for God. So let's pray this morning. God, thank you so much for each person here this morning. God, those who stood up and just acknowledged that they need wisdom this morning. And God, they're turning to the right source. James said it. They're looking up. They're looking to heaven. They're looking to you, their Father, to answer this need for wisdom in their life. And so, God, I know that brings a smile to your face, that we turned in the right direction. And so, God, I don't know what they're facing. I don't know what they're looking for wisdom for, but God, you do. You're aware of their life. You know of the sleepless nights. You know of the times that they've paced back and forth, the times where they've logged into their bank account and just struggled to see a way forward, God. And I know that you're a loving God. You've got me through some really tough places in life. And so, God, I pray for each person standing, but even those who stayed seated that need wisdom, God, would you pour it out? Would you give them that little nugget of truth today? God, that they would go home knowing what they need to do, knowing how they need to act. God, you're faithful. You promised us if we ask that we will receive wisdom. And so I pray for these brothers and sisters of mine today that they would get the wisdom that they need. God, may we always be a church that cries out for wisdom. God, that we don't think that we've got all the answers, because we don't. You do, and so we turn to you this morning for wisdom. Thanks for this time. In Jesus' name, amen.